Dawn of the Conquerors, Book 1, The Meijadin Revelations, written and narrated by Rowan McPhee. The following is a work of fiction. All names, places, characters and events are either the product of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, other literary works or forms of media is entirely coincidental. Chapter 1. It was on his travels east across the south of Frankfurt that Berthold Forst arrived one evening at Renholdt, a mining town of some former glory nestled in a western crook of the Varian peaks. The nearest main road was an artery from the heart of the nation that flowed all the way down to the southern corner border of Poldresard. This was the furthest he had ever travelled, his first foray into the wider world. 2.5 decades on his parents' farm had drifted by with the bucolic languor of its golden years. Halcyon days of youth, baling hay, tilling earth, and lake-dipping off the shores of sun-ripened cornfields. Treasured memories that would never age, but Berthold had, enough to realise his rustic roots had anaesthetic charms that would consume him if he let them. It had been hard to say goodbye to his family, his village, his people, to see their loving faces riddled with concern and incomprehension at his statement of intention. Only sheer force of will, of which Berthold was certain he had a considerable amount, had allowed him to turn his back on everything he knew and leave home for good. This was the key to life he had learned from his secret book, its words as clear as the arcane law they were written in. Those who felt the call to power must seize their destiny and create a greater purpose in this world. Had he been an ordinary man with trammels befitting his stock, Berthold might have feigned an injury to hobble back to the village, whose day-to-day goings were forgettable enough to take such a short-lived flight of fancy in their stride. Barflies would have chuckled into their ales and glossed over such tepid news with tales of their own youthful escapades, while their cuckoo wives tittered trifles across washboards and sewing circles. Such ventures were rarer in peacetime as young men, no longer whisked away into service by the draft, stayed home to carry on their father's trades. Uncalled soldiers tilled the fields, milled the grain, thatched the barns. Some banded together to form local unions, others speculated on mineral markets that had sprung up in the wake of the Second Great War with Drusille, Frankfurt's neighbouring empire. This humdrum haze might have swept him up and kept him too, had he not come into possession of Rakamazu's tome. A vast codex of occult knowledge, and the cryptic legacy of an esoteric profession whose heyday had long since passed. It had taken him several years of study to decipher even the most basic spell forms. Now he was gaining ground every time he opened its pages. Berthold could feel it sitting at the bottom of his haversack as the wagon's uneven gait jostled it back and forth. Ancient and heavy, bound with thick leather and talon-clutched with iron lashings as every true grimoire should be. He patted its square bulk through the rough fabric, as if it was a sentient pet he was promising to play with later. It pulsed in response, pulling his attention towards it like a powerful beast straining at its tethers. Berthold ignored it and kept his eyes level on the hedgerows of the scrolling countryside, assured there would be time to probe its depths in privacy later. Money was the linchpin of this endeavour, the pittance he had saved mere kindling to light the fire of his new life. That was his hope, his bet, his plan. If he didn't hit pay dirt soon, he'd be working odd jobs and sleeping in a barn instead of his own bed. A life of adventure would have its hardships, this he knew, but could forego the embarrassment of any initial floundering going straight back up the grapevine. Such trivialities were a far cry from the secret ambitions that lay bound up in the heart of one Berthold Forst. As his ride docked his horses into an open stall bay off the main road that ran through Renholdt, Berthold waited until the driver had hitched them properly, in no rush to dismount until it was safe. It felt good when his boots hit the dirt after so many hours rattling around in the back of a wagon. Back on solid ground, he could hardly contain himself, brimming with intentions as he was. Patience, Berthold. The difference between the eager and the rash was sliver thin. He had a plan, all he had to do was execute it. Do things by the book, reap the rewards. Well, not that book, Berthold chuckled to himself as his locus of knowledge glowed darkly in the back of his mind. He would make time for it once he had sorted his affairs, his most urgent priority being accommodation. He'd be doing no study without shelter or sustenance. A glance up and down the benighted street told him this was a residential district, not where the taverns or inns were located. Women in shawls or aprons lit hanging lamps, while trios of men conspired to winch grand lanterns up their runners to the tops of their mounting poles. He continued east along the road, towards the ring market that was the centre stage of Renholdt. It didn't take Berthold long to find an inn whose prices were acceptable to him. With a few Ron's checks slid across the bar, he was, forthwith, the proud tenant of a second-story room in the beaten track, whose weathered timber facade straddled the line between rustic charm and disused shack. The inside motif was a staid vertical oak boarding, its corners edified by square-cut timbers lacquered into eternal adolescence. The decor followed him up to his room. Wood, wood, and more wood, with portraits of wooden things listing on the walls. A royal red carpet was the saving grace from its mind-numbing monotony, although as he examined his room, Berthold couldn't help but see it as if he was standing in a giant pool of blood. To his satisfaction, he found fresh sheets adequately folded over the mattress corners. It was also cleaner than he had expected. The lintel hadn't been dusted in a while, but more importantly, a quick drop to all fours confirmed there was nothing moving under the bed. Growing up on a farm, one always shook out the hay before bedding down for a night. Shrugging off his clothes, he folded them over the back of the desk's miniature companion chair and climbed under the duvet and blanket. Ideas for the morrow hummed in the back of his mind as he settled into sleep for the night. Breakfast was not included in the price, which disappointed Berthold greatly when the time rolled around the following morning, despite the fact he had known that when he paid for the room. The establishment was redeemed slightly by a communal pot of tea in the upstairs foyer. A big, round onion bulb of porcelain with a chipped, burned underskirt sat on a raised copper spiral seat over a glowing coal bed. Strong enough to get a man going about his business, Berthold concluded as he sipped the coarse brew while he lay on his bed. Far from merely lounging, he'd already collected several promising flyers from a news board and its attendant pamphlet rack. Berthold thumbed through them all carefully, noting the venues of the events being held and pinning them visually to a local map of the village included. All of the civic and municipal buildings were past the ring market, at the far end of town. With his investigative targets mentally committed, it was time to tend to his secondary, more pressing concern, the gnawing pangs of his stomach. He slid on his boots, grabbed his coin purse and headed out of the door. An hour later, Berthold returned with a modest bag of goods in one hand and his thimbleful coin purse in the other. He felt like a gelded stooge, robbed blind by highwaymen and left hanging upside down over a bridge without his trousers. There was no escaping the obvious truth. Against the grueling yardstick of poverty, even the cheapest items were expensive. He set the bag down alongside his withered purse on the crude wooden desk. Only the tinkle of bronze remained. Gold and silver had their own sounds, heavier, denser, more metallic on the reverb, something he'd learned from the book, which called out to him from his satchel bag as he thought of it. "Read me!" Berthold considered it for a moment as it rattled away like a bird that had grown a little too large for its cage. It hadn't always been this way. The more he read of it, the more it had begun to react to his efforts. A symbiotic intimacy with his craft had enmeshed him, an unexpected mental expansion beyond the self that transcended any regular book he had ever read. One day he'd been plain old Berthold, the next he had become something more, so much more, and more yet to be. In spite of his fear of privation, Berthold had shopped thriftily and invested his precious coinage into a median balance of cost, nutrition, and longevity. Storage was always a problem, but now he lacked even the basic amenities of home to cook with. His other singular possession lay in his bag beside the tome, a cast-iron saucepan his mother had given him from her small collection. Gartered with rust around its base as it was, he suspected she had just been glad to be rid of it. The handle was newer, its original having been replaced after it had broken some years back. Though Berthold had been grateful for the gift, it lacked the volume necessary for the dish he had in mind. Looking out of his door, he saw the hall and foyer were deserted. Steam chuffed out of the teapot's spout as it simmered on its copper coil stand, and as he gazed at it longingly, an idea began to form in his head. Berthold made his way downstairs towards the kitchen entrance, trying to look as inconspicuous as possible. Serving staff bustled to and fro, arms stacked with trays and no time to spare on loitering patrons. A waiter pedalled out an ornate wooden dolly cart with a fancy roast centerpiece on its upper deck, It was just the cover he needed to slip in through the staff entrance without being noticed. Inside, the layout of the place stymied him immediately. He scurried down one aisle, only to double back again to hide from a pair of cooks, who swanned past his eyeline with a tempting tray of treats. His stomach rumbled its lack of satiety, nullifying any pretense of stealth he might have had going for him. Fortunately, the kitchen's ambient noise covered his gurgling beacon. A snack would keep it quiet if he could find one. Berthold ransacked a cross-section of mini-drawers lining each side of the aisle's tall cupboards as he moved along its countertops. He found nothing but spices, cornstarch, and dried potato flakes, the latter of which tasted like fried gravel and were about as filling, he discovered from shoveling a bunch into his hungry mouth. Rummaging for supplies brought back fond memories of youthful pantry raids, even as he sweated being caught red-handed by a cook, who would at least shoo him out if not report him to the owner for theft. Then how would he acquire a saucepan large enough for his needs? Even a cheap one was currently out of his price range if he was to afford tomorrow's rent and a stick of bread. He wasn't stealing anything anyway, merely borrowing it, to be cleaned and replaced before he left. A single saucepan wouldn't be missed for a couple of days. Where in the seven hells did they keep the cookware in this blasted kitchen anyway? Berthold switched aisles and followed the new one up to a preparation suite full of knife racks and carving boards. A diagonal brought him to a fire pit hub, atop which several chain-suspended vats hung over magma-spill coal beds. The open area was a nexus of oppressive heat and irate voices. Ruddy-faced cooks barked orders and cursed staff, while stressed-looking kitchen aides added ingredients by the sackful, flooding the kitchen with a pungent overlay of sealing mist. Berthold saw two porters coming towards him, and ducked through a pair of double doors into what he presumed was a pantry. It was dark and cool inside, but the air had a distinctive coppery tang to it. He soon realized why, as his eyes were drawn to the bovine corpse dangling from the ceiling. Blood coagulated on the mesh of its sluice-grated floor, above which the cold, flayed carcass of a cow swung from a meat hook on a thick iron chain. A pair of surly butchers were in the midst of pulling out its organs through a hole in the animal's side, while a third sorted and weighed the viscera on a blood-stained scale. All three turned to regard him with languid gazes, as if he was just another lump of flesh to be dissected, should he volunteer for it. "Help you, mister?" No, I can see you're busy." "Suit yourself." Berthold clicked the doors closed behind him and breathed out slowly. That had been a close one. Well, perhaps he was being a little hyperbolic. None of them had queried seeing someone they didn't recognize skulking around. They were carvers who probably spent all of their time in the abattoir and didn't know the wider retinue of staff. Others who did might find him more conspicuous, so he mentally added an apron to his list of things he was looking for. He grimaced at the thought. This was now quickly becoming a less than surgical infiltration. He had only come here for a saucepan, and now he was playing around with disguises. Berthold straightened up and turned around to retrace his steps and look elsewhere. Before he could react, a cook holding a large tureen barged in front of him and set it down hastily upon a freestanding dolly. He fanned his fingers and whipped out a notepad with a draw speed that would be the envy of any burgeoning assassin. "Damn it, that's hot," he blustered. His eyes darted across to Berthold, looking him up and down with mild disgust. "You, get this out to table 16. "Me?" "No, my uncle's pet donkey." "Yes, you. Where's your apron, anyway?" I don't..." Without looking up, the cook reached into his apron's belly pouch, pulled out another and flung it at Berthold's face. The move caught him off guard, and for a moment the world disappeared behind a dirty white veil. He pulled the dubious-smelling cloth bundle from his head. "There, now get moving." "But..." "Table 16. Got it? Go!" Berthold resigned himself to his press-ganged pantomime and donned the apron. Inside, he despaired. He'd been seen, spoken to a cook, now roped into menial duties he wasn't even being paid for. If he'd known finding a large saucepan would be this much hassle, he might have just asked if they needed an extra dishwasher for the afternoon and pinched one himself. Too late to think of alternatives, he'd accepted this role now. It struck him as he trundled off with the dolly that in this moment, for all intents and purposes, he was a waiter. It didn't matter that it was a farce, that he was an interloper, a would-be cookware borrower come thief. He had a job to do, and waiting table 16 was now a part of it. Apron on, strings double-tied, Berthold strode out to the dining areas with a straight back and a spring in his step. If this performance didn't knock him dead, he'd retire from acting. The main dining area was dim and quiet, despite a number of full tables. It folded around several hard corners into other, smaller, adjacent rooms. The bar was its centerpiece, an old brick-style ceiling column with a translucent ring mosaic of empty wine bottles built into its rear wall. Hands on the cart, eyes straight ahead, thinking waiter thoughts, Berthold paced slowly enough to scan the tables without drawing attention to himself, hoping to make sense of the numbering arrangement in time without blowing his cover. The nearest table number plaques read 2, 3, and 7. He carried on to the end of the seating and cut left into the adjacent dining area. 12, 13, 14, 17. The numbers jumped over the entrance to the oak-panelled booths in the side corner of the room, whose hubbub of merry diners enveloped him as he stepped inside. Their good cheer was impossible to withstand, even as he was, for some reason, now deep undercover in a method-acting drama of his own machination. Pleasant faces thrown back in laughter were made enchanting by the contrasting shadows of candlelight. Feminine soloists burbled over their husbands' bass and tuba orchestra, their mirth keyed in such a way that filled a man with the urge to sit down and introduce himself. They couldn't all be married, could they? Berthold shook himself. At this rate, a dowry would be the quickest way he'd acquire this blasted saucepan. A divider trellis covered in ivy split the booth in two. On his right was table 15, attended by another waiter, which meant the one he was facing had to be 16, his target. Sure enough, his patrons signalled their acknowledgement and shifted their platters around to make room for his delivery. Serving cloth in hand, Berthold carefully lifted a rim-bubbling tureen from its tray. All eyes followed it as he set it down gently on the table. His delivery was smooth in spite of it being his first ever, enough to reassure him he could slip away unnoticed. As he began to bow out, he found their shadowy gazes had ensnared him in a web of polite expectation that bound him to the denouement of his facade. The question only he could answer was written on all their faces. He was a waiter, after all. Their waiter. Now they waited on him for the announcement that would bring it all together. Had the chef said what this dish was, though? The tureen was unmarked, and Berthold's memory came up blank. The rich scent of cooked meat wafted out from underneath the lid. If he could glimpse its contents, he might be able to deduce what they were. His heart beat slowly, as if turned by giant clockwork gears, while he mentally prepared himself to stall without stuttering. Yes. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you," he began, pulling the lid confidently from its basin. Meat shapes protruded from a thick brown sauce with some kind of green garnish sprinkled on top. Everyone peered in, some noses wrinkled uncertainly. The sensory distraction brought him precious extra seconds to try to identify the ambiguously appetizing dish. Hungry as Berthold was, he would have eaten it even if it didn't taste very good. Perhaps when he pulled a little money together, he could treat himself and find out. "Beef fillets?" he began, drawing inspiration from his earlier misstep into the abattoir. The confusion persisted as liquor-loosened faces peered at it owlishly and began querying one another. "Did you order beef fillet?" one man asked another. "Certainly not. Gives me heartburn." "I'm not sure this is beef fillet," his wife commented as she leant in for a closer look. "What did you say it was again, young man?" an older woman asked him. "Well, it's..." Berthold stammered, trying to think of a dish that vaguely matched the slop steaming in the orange glow of the candle family in the centre of the table. To think that in all this harebrained schemery, it would be his limited knowledge of dining cuisine that turned him out. Perhaps he should just back out and leave, tell them to enjoy it and hightail it back to his room. This was a great deal of theatrics to put on for an entirely unwitting audience, and he had other things to do. His stomach reminded him who was first in the queue of priorities by stabbing him in the ribs, and so the buffoonery continued. Lamb casserole with cress, garlic and dill sauce, stewed potatoes, carrots, celery, and wild turnip," the other waiter chimed in silkily, in a voice that inferred the not inconsiderable a favour it was doing him right now. "Took the words right out of my mouth," Berthold lied smoothly. "Can I use your dolly for dishes? My table's ready to clear." "Of course. I don't need it now." "I'm sure you don't." "What do you mean?" The waiter turned his back to the question as he reached over his table and collected the dirty plates. Berthold waited for him to reply, wryly aware of the layered ironies of waiting on a waiter while impersonating a waiter himself. It might have been the stress of the situation, but it seemed as if it took the man an unnecessarily long time to turn and face him again. Eventually, he turned back and their gazes met. The other man's expression remained neutral, but there was something in his eyes that said he knew more than he was saying aloud. With the last plate stacked on the dolly, he straightened and muttered something under his breath. 5 minutes, kitchens, spice racks. What was that? Meet me in the kitchens? Ah, in 5 minutes? Yes. By the spice racks. Right, I will. Do you know where those are? Yes, of course, Berthold replied, unsure of the implication being made. Having relinquished his all-important prop card, his imaginary duties evaporated, responsibilities from which Berthold strode away with an odd tinge of regret. Inane as it was, he felt like a man who had quit in the first hour of a new job. How real we make it all for ourselves, Berthold chuckled to himself as he let himself back into the kitchen. It didn't matter if people saw him now. He was there on license, ready to brandish the waiter's words as if he were a foreign diplomat with sovereign immunity. A couple of cud-chewing cooks ignored him while they ladle-tasted a big pot of stew being lined up for service. Berthold sidled down the spice racks, closing a few drawers to hide the evidence of his earlier rummaging. Minutes ticked by as he stood idle in his apron. He hoped to avoid speaking to anyone else and having to fabricate any more stories. Keeping up appearances was tedious work. At the 5-minute mark, the waiter appeared. He approached Berthold and stuck out his hand, which Berthold shook politely. What are you doing? Waiting for you. He reached out and tugged at Berthold's apron strings. I mean this. The cook, a big bearded fellow, he made me wear it. Intriguing. What else does he make you wear? It's all right. You can tell me. Very funny, Berthold sniffed. Look, I don't know who you are or what you're doing, but you don't work here. Well, are you saying you do work here? Who's covering Rika's late shift on the bar tonight, then? The waiter had him cornered, yet he was being friendly enough. Tired from his earlier performance, and even hungrier now, Berthold decided to chance it with honesty. You're right. I don't work here. I'm just a passing traveller staying at the inn for a few days while I seek out new prospects. I came down to see if I could find something and took a wrong turn. Then this cook appeared. He had that dish ready, mistook me for a server and wouldn't take no for an answer. It seemed important to him. I thought about those patrons at the table, how disappointed they would be wondering if it was coming, or if it turned up cold. As silly as it may sound, I went along with it because it seemed easier to do him, everyone, a favour. The waiter regarded him for a moment before knocking his head left in a this-way kind of bodily indication. Berthold watched him reach under the counter at a key point. He released a catch that allowed him to push a slice of the aisle back and aside on its runners, enough to thread himself through sideways with crab-like precision. It was dimmer on the far side, couched in shadow beneath the golden-red sheen of the fire pits illuminating the ceiling-high wall cupboards. The gleam of metal drew Berthold's gaze onto an object the waiter had produced from a pocket or belt clip. It looked like some kind of tin, an assumption proven correct as the man flipped open its lid to reveal a small storage recess, from which he produced 2 small brown leaf-wrapped cones, about the size of a small cigar. A pungent scent of pine and lemon hooked Berthold's nose as the waiter extended one to him. The reason for this tryst was clear. He not only wanted to talk, but to share his break with a decadent luxury. Not wanting to offend him, Berthold accepted the wrap and put it to his lips. Cigars were an older man's preference from what he'd seen of his father and the stool-toads in the local taverns, smoked on occasion rather than with any kind of regularity. He wasn't sure if smoking them made you look more distinguished, or if you had to act as such as proper etiquette for a refined inhalant token. To ask would make him look naive, so he accepted it with grace. Convivial as this fellow was being towards him, Berthold was still no closer to the acquisition of his pan. The waiter used a fire steel striker to ignite a kindling strip and light a small candle sitting in a nearby holder, then brought the quivering flame to the end of both their wraps. Berthold imitated the other man's moves by drawing the unlit end to his lips to inhale, where he drew a deep drag down into a protracted lung hold, a good 10 seconds by his count, then released a thick cloud of cloying smoke in front of him. The taste surprised him with its identicality to the flavour notes dominant in its odour. Unexpectedly pleasant, Berthold decided as he puffed away on his wrap. That does sound a bit silly, Mr. Berthold Forst. Jad Skiff. Silly as you are, Mr. Forst, I appreciate the sentiment, and so would Burgo, the doughboy who roped you into this pinny. Timing is tight and food goes cold quick, so extra hands are always useful. It was nothing really, just the right time, place and notion. Some people say that's all success really is, Jad replied with all the squeakiness of someone trying to talk through a fully inflated pair of lungs. And are the people who say that successful themselves? Berthold quipped back, surprised by his own candour. Berthold felt suddenly relaxed and sociable, like Jad was his new best friend, that he could tell him all about his silly plan to steal a pan and borrow the coal bed on the communal teapot to make a stew in his bedroom. He found himself laughing with him, laughing about something anyway. What was it? His memory of the previous moment had gone up in smoke. Jad might have said something genuinely amusing, but Berthold had no idea what it was or why it had happened. Why was any of this happening, for that matter? Jad cocked his head to and fro while he weighed his answer. Some, yeah. I work here, so I can't say as I've rubbed elbows with many successful people. But then again, you never get anywhere if you stay on the beaten track. Berthold glanced around at the grimy cupboards and faded worktops. This place seems all right for what it is. The city bars likely pay better, and oh! Jad's pun became funnier in his head, like a blue bottle buzzing louder in his ear. Jad was right, Berthold decided as he fell onto his elbow on the countertop running down the wall side of the aisle. He was a very silly fellow, and had been caught right in the middle of his own very silly scheme. Jad nodded and smirked with mirth as he puffed away on his wrap, clearly enjoying the break in his day that Berthold's shenanigans had brought him. Jad, I must say this tobacco has an unusual flavour, much less bitter and harsh than the brand I once tried as a lad. Winter festival, round the bonfire, youthful experimentation sort of thing. Wasn't even my idea, in fact. One of the older boys had pinched it from his father's luxury stash. Jad nodded contentedly through lidded eyes. Oh yes, good for what ails you, this stuff. Yes, well, I was going to be honest with you. Jad leant forward solemnly with arms crossed over his chest, wrap glowing like a taper in the corner of his mouth. Let's hear it, Berthold. Confess your sins to Father Jad. I came down here to find a saucepan, but I was too embarrassed to ask for one. So I snuck in hoping I could borrow one and put it back later without anyone noticing. Silly, I know. I should have just asked. Jad studied him through a cloud of smoke. What do you want a saucepan for? I was going to borrow the tea heater coil and its coal bed in the foyer upstairs, bring it into my room and try and make a stew with the groceries I bought. Have you not seen the price of our lamb chop special? Too cheap to even give it a try? Honestly, I'm down to my last few rons right now. Destitute if I don't bring in some coins soon. I could probably reach home eating scraps, but I'm out here trying to make it on my own. Hard times, eh, Berthold Forst? Hard times indeed, Berthold agreed glumly, as the choker of poverty pulled taut on his spirit, dimming its effervescence. Listen, as much as I'm enjoying this artful dodge with you, I must get back to work. I'd tell you where to find a saucepan, but after your noodle-headed wanderings I think it'd just be easier to bring you one myself, Jad stated with mock severity as he stubbed out his wrap in the candle holder and slipped it back into his pocket tin. Berthold waited while Jad slipped away, then returned a minute later with 2 items in his clutches. One was a large saucepan with a matching lid, just the thing he'd been looking for. The other was a heating coil with a coal basin, identical to the one upstairs in the foyer, except larger. Coal is in the big sacks to the left of the door you came in. Don't tell the warden, and don't set your room on fire. The warden? Oh, right, your employer. And no, I won't cause any explosions making a stew. Jad nodded approvingly before turning away and heading back to his duties. Good. See you. Oh, wait, Jad. Jad slowed and turned to show he was listening while still in motion. Berthold held up the half-finished stub, smouldering between his two fingers. You forgot your, cigar. Jad waved it away nonchalantly. Finish it, Berthold. Just make sure you keep your window open if you smoke it in your room. Thank you, I will. Berthold called out to Jad's back as he disappeared round an aisle corner. Berthold stood there for what seemed like an age, holding Jad's gifts, his desired cookware, then realised it had only been a few seconds. Strange, thought Berthold. His sense of time seemed to be ebbing and flowing instead of its usual linear tick. He felt relaxed and floaty, yet clear-headed. His greater ambition seemed impossibly far away, but that didn't matter. He was ready to focus on something immediate. What did he need to do most of all? What should be his number one priority right now? The quandary sat on his shoulder like a raven, and he pondered it with the sear and serious consideration due to questions of the ages. His stomach gurgled, twisting his insides, and the answer became clear once again. Right, food, Berthold muttered to himself. An hour later, the spices were in and the stew was bubbling away beneath its lid. It hadn't taken him long to have the iron ring coil glowing red. He'd set it up in the small fireplace, whose domed copper hood helped purge the coal smoke up its narrow chimney. Berthold felt as if he had lived through a royal epoch, dicing so many vegetables up into tiny cubes. Tedious prep work that made for easier mashing to turn the soup into a stew. Now it was cooking, the scent of it was filling the room. He sat back on his bed, proud of his handiwork. Berthold hoped no one would notice the fresh knife marks he'd made on the desk he'd used as an impromptu chopping board. Something he probably could have gone downstairs and asked for, or borrowed under the provisional auspices of his acquaintance with Jad. It didn't matter. The funny green tobacco he'd smoked had relaxed him greatly. He felt a lot more at ease with his life choices, but was aware it had made him blither in the same breath. Such anxieties were themselves remedied by smoking more of it. He'd relit his wrap by stubbing its cindered end in the coal bed and taking a couple of deep drags, remembering at least to blow his smoke out of the window. There was just something rather lofty and satisfying about smoking by himself, Berthold decided as he ground its ember out onto the desk, never mind the burn mark it left behind. He put it out of his mind and pocketed the stub for later on. Berthold lay comfortably at rest on his bed, watching the stew simmer from across the room. It had taken so much effort to get this far that the lull caught him off guard. He shut his eyes for a moment and allowed his mind to wander. It felt surprisingly clear, if a little floaty. His mood was, in a word, excellent. Read me. He felt the pull of the tome strongly enough that it felt like it would come to his outstretched hand if he willed it, though he knew of no such tricks. Perhaps it was time he learned some, he thought. The stew would be a while yet, and he didn't have anything else to do right now. Berthold sat up and looked around his room, sizing it up for space and privacy. It was a cosy affair, its largest patch of floor space between the bed, wardrobe and window. Enough for his purposes, he surmised. He had the spell theorem down pat, he simply needed to practice it. Summoning one or two would suffice. He strode over to his bag and pulled out the tome, and since the crummy chair provided was too awkward to sit in, he returned to the bed. Power swirled like a current through his fingertips on contact with its waxy, leather-bound, iron-clad hide. The whisperings in his ear grew louder and more excited. The practice of it as magic was far more than mere parlour conjuring Berthold had once, in his ignorance, imagined it to be. From his initial readings, it was not premature or delusional to say that with enough time, skill, and luck, the words danced on his tongue. Even to vocalise it inside his own head felt too great a risk, as if the thought would instantly make him into a lightning rod for the ire of jealous gods, waiting to snuff out the first hint of a challenge to their cosmic order of things. Still, the undercurrent of his megalomaniacal ambition could not be denied. The tome shuddered with the pulse of power that shook his arms all the way up to his eyes. Visions danced before them as if he'd been struck full on by a sun ray. Its energies resonated with his thoughts, shoring up his uncertainty like a termite-built throne. Unbidden, his tongue rolled, his lips parted, and words escaped his throat. With this, he began, as if by way of paternally coaxed litany recital. Anything is possible, he whispered aloud. The tome seethed at his tepid evocation of its desires. Say it! It whipped itself up into a frenzy, swirling with the fury of a sentient storm. Say it! Say it! Say it! It shook in his hands as the energies contained within it thrashed against its leather bindings. Encouragement was mere foreplay. This was an edict as clear as any royal decree. It demanded, commanded him to obey. The viciousness of its vigour unsettled him a little. This thing had hooks in him, hooks that ran deep into intangible places that would not be removed by selling it on or throwing it into an abyss. Berthold reassured himself that he was in control, that the mad book was at least on his side. Its foreword had assuaging references to this sort of thing being routine teething troubles for novice darkitects, no different than the spirited shenanigans of an unbroken colt or filly. It was also uniquely reassuring to have such a visceral advocate behind him at all times. It reminded Berthold of a trapper his father had once told him about, a giant of a man who had domesticated a wild bear by wrestling it into exhaustion across many surprise attacks. Once broken, the bear travelled with him at all times. He'd even trained it to help him move lumber to build a log cabin in the mountains, as the tale was told. What Berthold had was infinitely more valuable than some measly bear, and knew its own worth. It understood that was what he was really afraid of, that once he was in there was no getting out of it. Not on this path. Take up crocheting for fair weather summers and quiet pastures at the grey end of your days was the implication. And who could argue with that if these words were the fire that burned in one's heart? Just say it, admit it, accept it, roll the dice, play your hand. Berthold sat up and pressed his hands into the cover, its waxy texture almost sensual like the touch of a woman's flesh. Suddenly it all made sense. Give such lofty ambition the respect it deserves by speaking it into words, and maybe it will happen. A small smile cornered his lips as he sat cross-legged on the bed, basking in herb-augmented communion with his prized possession. With this, he began again, now sure of the words to come. I could. The words simmered on his lips like the quench of freshly hammered steel. Conquer the world.